Okay, we'll continue this. The purple cobras. I set up a donation for the purple cobras. I should. Now that we're here on Halo, that's funny to me. I almost jumped into Magic. I could do a deck at least. I'm not gonna play though. Again, the purple cobras. That's what we were on Halo with the purple cobras, so that's where we're at now. I guess we were doing both. Technically, we were doing both, weren't we? We did have a tournament, didn't we? Damn. That's a tough one. I really want to go to it. At least make a deck. Again, no. With the two balls there, I think is what we're pointing out. I forget. It's still like, it's like 1920, so they have electricity. I forget about. They have radio and all that. I forget about that. They're modern, ish. It would be ideal to go on there. I will do at least one. Let me play a game here. However, they have pictures, so let it be clear here. Down at the Dempster. It's almost like someone with a cheek ring. Make a Pokemon deck. I don't have enough cards for that. Otherwise, I would. Purple Cobras. Daily? I didn't even think about that. I'm pretty sure it is Salvador. 1904? This is young Salvador. If you look at the picture, that has to be. Sir. I never even thought about it. That didn't dawn on me. I just kind of randomly started doing these books, you know what I mean? After I posted the paintings, I didn't even realize. I've never even heard of the purple sapphire, so it's good to be in the room. I didn't realize. I always sit there and wonder about you. I'll allow you to continue here.
For instance, only the other day. Then he broke off, and I never knew, nor was there any record among his private memoranda, what had disturbed the primrose path of scientific research on this occasion.
As far as I'm concerned,
I was sitting in the den, waiting for Marquand as usual. I never liked to go to bed till he returned, and I knew that Leela had been safely packed off home, and I had been to sleep, also as usual. Suddenly, the beam from the observatory swung into the den, and the gong sounded furiously. I snatched up the receiver, but nothing came excepting confused sounds and a violent crackling like that of a radiogram transmitter. I flung it down and rushed over to the observatory and burst in. It was full of a brilliant violet light, independently of the arc light, and a smell of burning. Mark 1 was standing as I entered, and whether my overwrought senses deceived me or not, I cannot tell now, but it seemed to me that a female form, overwhelmingly comely, I must admit, was kneeling on the floor at his feet, her arms encircling his waist and her head turned towards the complicated mirrors and cells which constituted Mark 1's end of the apparatus. Terror was in the beautiful dark face, and she seemed to be trying to shield him, to protect him from something invisible to me. But the whole vision only lasted a second or two. Then a sort of seismic cataclysm took place. All the lights went out, and the observatory was in pitch darkness, save that on the floor appeared a circle about a yard in diameter, not exactly luminous, but scintillating. I fumbled for the lighting switch. I got no light, but I got a shock that I shall remember to my dying day. It made me violently sick. After a delay which seemed to me to be like an age in length, I got at my matches and struck a light, and lit a couple of candles which always stood on the table in case of the current failing at any time. The phototelephone apparatus was wrecked. It looked like the debris of a spring mattress in a marine storekeeper's backyard. The telescope was twisted off its massive base and was hanging nearly to the floor. There was a rent in the dome beside the observation slit. I was vividly aware of an uncanny silence, and then I saw that the sidereal clock and the heliostat had both stopped. Their sonorous tick would have been such a comfort. I was alone with Marquand. He was lying on the floor where I had seen him standing, quite motionless, and quite normal, save that his lips were drawn back, showing both rows of teeth in a ghastly grin. Recollection of first aid classes came to me.
Escape.
Electric shock, artificial respiration, and so on. I loosened his waistcoat, trousers band, and shirt collar, and began to apply my inadequate knowledge.
He lived a while.
There was a sickening
goodness.
smell as I gradually got him undressed. Then I knew
He saw
he
me
was dead.
born, I guarantee it.
I made a violent effort to retain my presence of mind, my sanity, to think. There would be doctors, an inquest, people prying about viewing the body. Horrible. I felt that at all hazards I must view it first. I undressed Marquand very carefully. The instantaneous blanching of death had made his fair skin look whiter, and he was physically uninjured externally at any rate. But round his waist, where I had seen the arms of Alila, was a deep brown and blistered band. He had been girt in a zone of fire which had burnt deeply beyond the skin into his body, but his clothes were not even singed. A detail, in the small of his back, was the burnt impress of a small right hand, deepest at the fingertips. All I could think about was, I wonder where her other hand was. I sat and looked at Marquand, I don't know how long, but suddenly, through the rent in the dome, I saw it was dawn. I dressed him carefully. I wonder if you have any idea of how difficult it is to dress a dead body. He was also growing stiff. I made myself think with a mighty effort. How did he die? The newspapers, the obituary notices, the coroner. Of course, the dynamo. I dragged Marquand over to the dynamo, which was apparently wrecked too. I forced up his stiff arm so that the hand rested on the commutator. I took the key off his watch chain. Where I had seen the scintillating circle in the darkness lay a ring of pale gray dust. This struck me, and taking a small, ordinary collector's corked tube from Marquand's laboratory bench, I filled it with the dust and put it into my waistcoat pocket. Then I crept back, like a murderer, to the study, found the writing case, and put it in my portmanteau. Then
Above you,
I wrapped all the
Yeah, he's gonna.
What's it behind you also?
end of section
Middle,
2.
sandbag.
Enemy has the ball.
Section 3 of The Purple Sapphire and Other Posthumous Papers by Christopher Blayre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Purpura Lapillus.
Ball dropped.
Wilkes.
Lost the
The
lead.
merchant hardly raised his
Enemy has
voice.
the ball.
It was only when a passerby slackened his pace before the establishment and looked in the direction of the stock in trade with an expression of interest, an expression the merchant had learned by long experience to gauge with surprising accuracy, that he ejaculated on a note of interrogation his everlasting monosyllable. Wilkes? The establishment occupied by prescriptive right some 8 feet of the roadway against the curb. It was of semi-nocturnal habit, arriving at its post, known as its pitch, late in the afternoons. At each corner, sooty flames struggled through greasy lamp chimneys to irradiate the stock in trade. A few yards away, a constant procession of omnibuses punctuated the throbbing life of the Edgware Road. The stock in trade piled high against the back of the barrow, a pale yellow heap of shells, diffused a marine aroma which fought for supremacy with the more pungent perfume that spurted continuously from a little pipe projecting from the facade of the sausage and mashed emporium on the landward side of the pavement. The roadway below the barrow was strewn with empty whelk shells, the lately evicted inhabitants of which lay coiled in small circular plates of doubtful cleanliness, disposed along the front of the establishment. 2 penworth, Daddy, and fat ones, ladies for choice, said Albert. Albert was a wag, and also a regular customer. Daddy looked up in nervous greeting. He knew Albert and prayed to Neptune that he might be in his good mood. Albert's bad mood was recognizable by a tendency to critical sarcasm that had been known to blight trade for half an hour at a time. Pick 'em out where you like, Albert. You're a judge. Thus Daddy, slavishly obsequious. Wilkes. The word formed a full stop to his every utterance. His lips once unsealed by the necessities of commerce, it seemed a pity not to include his trade announcement as a recurrent termination. Wilkes! The professor was returning home, dog-tired after a day of research culminating in a lecture. With the semi-unconscious habit of the systematic zoologist, he murmured to himself as he reached the establishment, Buckingham undatum. He paused and cast a rapid glance over the heaped-up shelves. The whelk barrow, like its aristocratic rival the oyster stall, is often a happy hunting ground for the professor. At both establishments, an infinite world of marine life may be found encrusting the shelves. Polyzoa, ascidians, annelids. You never know what you might find. He paused. Wilkes, said Daddy. A new customer, perhaps. A cut above his usual clientele, no doubt. But who knows what strange cravings may suddenly develop even in a toff whose normal taste would lead him to Whitestable natives and champagne wine. Daddy had once sold a plate of Wilkes to one whom he identified from the picture postcards as a cabinet minister. The merchant kept an anxious eye upon Albert. His patron, the small plate poised upon his left fingertips, was detaining the vinegar which he grasped in his right hand. A lady wanted it, and was on the verge of becoming articulate. Daddy trembled. Albert's small eyes were fixed in what Daddy could not but realize was a baleful glare upon the stock in trade. Bad luck. Albert was evidently in his bad mood. Slowly he replaced the plate upon the barrow and handed the vinegar to the lady with the deadly observation. You be careful what you're eating, Mara. A ripple of disquiet visibly ran over the clientele. It was, I believe, Dr. Johnson who observed that the only requisite for the perfect enjoyment of sausages is implicit confidence. It is the same with shellfish. They share with the egg and Caesar's wife the imperative necessity of being above suspicion. Now then, Albert, what's wrong with you? You're overeating yourself at the oysters. Thus Daddy anxiously and with ill-conceived alarm, hoping to carry the war into the enemy's country with a rapid thrust of wit. But Albert was not to be disarmed. He had facts to go upon. The storm broke. There, what you're giving us, Wilkes? I don't think so. What's this? And this? And this? With unerring eyes and dirty fingers, he rapidly pricked from the heap 3 smaller univalves, thicker in texture, whiter in color, which he exhibited to the clientele in the palm of his hand. From one of them, as it rolled over, a small stream of yellowish-purple fluid oozed. "Struth!" cried the patron as he dropped the shells among the plates already decked with the red and white blobs which had once inhabited the discarded shells. "They're poisonous, and that's the poison." The stricken business came to a standstill, but the crowd immediately increased in density. Daddy became active and vocal in distress. "They're all right," he said loudly. "They're only dog wills, a smaller size, just as good. But I don't serve them, not never. Because, why? Not that they're bad, mind you, but because they're small, and I always give my customers good measure. Full portions. You know that, Albert." This despairingly in a last effort to propitiate the foe. "Oh yes, we all know about that, don't we?" The lady chimed in. "My sister's husband had a niece what ate a wrong wilk, She had spots. Awful. And she died. The crowd became murmurous. Half a dozen hideous reminiscences framed the lips of the bolder cognoscenti. The professor picked up the damning evidence. Purpura lepidus, he observed, the habit of a lifetime overmastering appreciation of his audience. There, the gentleman says they're poisonous, he knows. Thus Albert, springing to greet a heaven-sent witness for the prosecution. Oh, not at all, said the professor. Then catching sight of the agony depicted on Daddy's features, he went on. They are only a smaller whelk, but as the man says, they are not eaten, for the dye in them makes them unattractive. The merchant threw him a glance which was a benediction, and the professor had an inspiration. I will take these, said he. Have you any more? In the manner of nervous conspirators, he and Daddy picked out another 3 from the heap. I am glad to have them. And with a look of infinite comprehension, he put 6 pence into Daddy's hand, ostentatiously, and disappeared into the Edgware Road.
Enemy has the ball.
He's dirty, said Albert. The crowd was confused by the multitude of testimony and dissolved, divided between admiration of the knowledgeable Albert's heroic defense of the public and sympathy for the mad toff who was doubtless on his way home to commit suicide. Business did not recover that evening. The windy crowd were not allowed to forget that a great and learned toff had convicted Daddy of selling a poisonous winkle called purple bilious as whelks. The office of this propaganda was the establishment of the oyster merchant a little farther down the street. After his solitary meal, the professor returned to his study to put in a few hours' work on his monograph of the British mollusca. He was, as previously recorded, dog-tired. On his blotting pad lay the half-dozen dog whelks which he had put down when he came in. Where they lay, the white paper had absorbed a patch of the fluid, which, upon exposure to light, becomes a deep purple stain. The professor looked at it with weary eyes. Purpura lapis, he murmured again. And this is Tyrian purple. It seemed such an anachronism, the animal that yielded its marvelous color to the dyers of Tyre and Tarsus 1,500 years ago before the Augustan age, to become later the distinguishing mark of the officials and nobility of the Roman Empire, sold on a barrow in a side street, and the subject of a costermonger's quarrel with a 24-carat cat. And then an echo of his early schooling came down the dream vista of time. No man buyeth their merchandise any more, the merchandise of gold, of purple. And he smiled wanly over the later revelation. And again, the soldiers put on him a purple robe, and said, Hail, King of the Jews. A world of thoughts crowded in upon him. The professor stretched himself and stared at the ceiling. Evidently he was in no mood for systematic zoology. His eyes fell upon the purple patch again. He wondered whether it was not exactly the breadth of the purple border of the toga praetexta. As a professor, he would have come under the jus toga praetexta habende. He would have been indistinguishable in the forum from the consuls, the praetors, the augurs, the aediles, so far as his apparel went. Perhaps as an augur he would have worn his purple in stripes on the trabea in the dawn of science. And, as the picture became clearer, the scene more actual, the professor rose, drew his toga more closely round him, gathered the flowing end over his left arm, and stepped forth from his house to join the groups converging upon the Colosseum. It was a premiere. He must hurry, for the application for seats from the would-be first nighters had been overwhelming. Titus had completed the monument which his father, Vespasian, had not lived to see perfected. The widow, Domitilla, and her daughter and namesake would be there. A new denarius had been struck with the Colosseum on its reverse as a souvenir of the occasion for the tourists who flocked to Rome from all parts of the empire. His seat was in the podium, level with the emperor and the senators. Beyond him, the Vestal Virgins were early comers, and their views upon the fashions prevailing at court and their speculations upon the coming show forced a treble note upon the great chord of sounds that filled the air imprisoned under the Valerian. The gratis had been filled to overflowing since the night before, especially the popularia, which reeked to heaven. Strangely enough, the experience was almost a new one to the professor. He had once been taken to a contest at the National Sporting Club, and it had made him feel sick. This and a rat hunt at Oxford constituted the limits of his experience of circenses. The afternoon wore on. He looked anxiously toward the seats of the Vestal Virgins, when the star Retiarius disemboweled a really most deserving secutor. But no one fainted. Then he pulled himself together, reflecting that the virgins seldom or never faint in the operating theaters of our hospitals. The two spectacles had much in common. The chariot races appealed most vividly to his London-bred senses. Some of the observations and epigrams
You talking about the stream being laid right there?
competitors reached his ears with startling distinctness. A shocked memory of the current vernacular of competing omnibus drivers in the Edgware Road came over him like the echo of a song. At first, he did not like to look at the Empress Marcia and her ladies, but when at last a constant repetition and unlimited application of the same word had dulled its primary significance, he looked towards the imperial box. The ladies were much amused. It seemed a terrible thing to the professor that the keepers should have allowed the council of the Zoological Society to sacrifice no less than 4 magnificent African lions, merely to make this opening performance a success. He was on the council himself and did not remember the matter ever having been brought before them.
I don't know how many times I have to tell you.
Clearly the secretary and curator were taken too much upon themselves, but then he reflected suddenly that Africa is much nearer to Rome than to Regent's Park, and that the settlement of strikes among the transport workers was conducted in the imperial city with a hatchet. He felt indeed a certain shamefaced satisfaction when the last lion successfully ate most of a rival professor of zoology before he could be induced, with red-hot irons, to return to his cage beneath the podium. The rival professor owed his unfortunate experience to a rash suggestion that man, including the emperor, was derived from the apes. He so far forgot himself as to shout, "Bravo, Toro!" Nevertheless, he had a sick headache when he walked home with the professor of applied mathematics in the evening. A dreary dog, this professor. He had lately been allowing himself a relaxation in pure mathematics, and had, after 4 months' assiduous work, proved that there was no possible solution to a problem which he had himself invented. He had talked of nothing else for 4 months, and the mood was still on him. The professor shook him off in the vestibulum of his house. He would have liked to come in and catch a drink. The professor's Falernian was justly celebrated, and go on talking, but the professor was firm. At the ostium he picked up his letters and reached the atrium dog-tired, still. Seated at his desk, his head fell forward onto his blotting pad from very weariness. A sharply pointed object dented his forehead, and he raised himself again to a sitting position with a start. The 6 dog whelks were still there. Fishermen called them stinkers. It occurred to the professor that, like many phrases in common use among seafaring folk,
How long is this video? 24 minutes, yeah.
bulk, the name was amply justified. He was clearly in no mood for systematic zoology. He went to bed. End of section 3. Section 4 of The Purple Sapphire and Other Posthumous Papers by Christopher Blayre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Thing That Smelt. To the zoologists of 25 years ago, the name of Augustine Black, Austin Black he called himself, was uncomfortably familiar. He was a patient and keen observer of animal life, and his photographs of beasts and birds, made under all kinds of critical conditions, were greatly and justly admired. But there was another and an extraordinary side to the man. He was a semi-professional spiritualist, and reaped a rich harvest, it was said, from that curiously constituted segment of humanity whose vanity leads them to seek for evidence of a personal life after death, who sit with obscurely disreputable mediums in lower middle-class parlors in doubtful neighborhoods, and accept the suggestions of the managers of such seances that the raucous cacklings of uneducated persons through tubes of brown paper are communications from their dear ones, who, in the cant phrase of the profession, have passed over. They even welcome the futile familiarities of John King, whose Arab face glowers over the circle, and incidentally may be bought for a few shillings from any reputable purveyor of conjurers' accessories. Austin Black's success in this branch of industry resulted from the fact that he ran his seances in his studio at Tulse Hill on more highly sophisticated lines. He had an admirable chamber organ, and employed a professional string quartet to play behind impermeable curtains what time materializations took place of high church dignitaries, whose Latin would disgrace a fourth-form schoolboy, and of eminent scientists whose scientific observations were startling in their puerility and ignorance. At the same time, it must be confessed that there were occasions upon which the phenomena exhibited in return for the guineas of his sitters, for his were not the normal 5-shilling entertainments, were, though futile, quite inexplicable to an ordinary observer. And a new patron had to be introduced by a convinced dupe, and the keen scrutiny of Austin Black, and his few well-chosen remarks and questions to the newcomer, made it clear that none but ordinary observers were privileged to get their money's worth. If Black was not satisfied as to gullibility, or suspected a plot to expose the modus operandi, the spirits lay doggo and would not perform. He would explain that there was an inimical influence present, and when the seance was given up, the habitués regarded and treated the stranger in such a manner as to convey to him that they considered that he had not only spoilt their evening, but had meanly swindled them out of the fees for that seance, and that stranger was never introduced again. I frequently met Austin Black at the scientific meetings of the Zoological Society, and in spite of his over-florid courtesy, he was to me as Dr. Fell of pious memory. It was therefore with mixed feelings that I yielded to my friend Mark Shelton's pressing invitation to assist at one of Black's seances in company with him and his friend George Carver. "No doubt he does help out his seances with tricks," explained Mark, "but things do happen there that I cannot explain in any way whatever. I do wish you would come, once at least." "What sort of things?" I asked. "Oh, little things, generally of no importance, which have little or nothing to do with the show. But at least twice there have been a sort of snarling in the room, and when this happens, Black stops the seance, says the controls are getting angry or out of hand, and then when the lights go up, he is a sight to see. Horrible. He seems to have worked himself up to such a pitch that he is white and sweating with terror. He bundles us all out as quickly as he can." I confess that this interested me. Shelton was an extraordinarily prosaic and clear-minded man, an idle man about town with ample means, and a beautiful apartment in the Albany. He did not believe in spiritualism as such, but confessed that the manifestations interested and, on occasion, thrilled him. He never missed a good conjuring show at a variety theater, and admitted that he loved to be taken in, and to see tricks and phenomena that passed his comprehension. Well, I went. Black had small, piercing, dark eyes and a little waxed mustache, and I found him a very different person from the obsequious Black I had avoided becoming accustomed to. He put me through a short but highly efficient cross-examination as to my experience of seances and my object in assisting at this one, but I managed to convey an impression of imbecility and to place in his hands my guilty secret that, in spite of my position as professor of zoology in the University of Cosmopoli, I was a dabbler in metaphysics, and prepared to admit the existence of superphysical forces which I did not understand, but viewed with respect. The solidity of my introduction, however, it was, that secured my admission to the circle, but Black was obviously on his guard, and nothing called for astonishment or remark in the performance, unless it was a materialization of Pope Innocent III, who welcomed and blessed us in a mixture of elementary school Latin and atrocious modern Italian. A cardinal was in attendance upon him who wore a long beard. I commented foolishly upon this, and Black quickly explained that he was a Franciscan cardinal, which entirely satisfied the circle, but put our ecclesiastical visitors to flight. "What did you think of it?" asked Shelton as we walked down to the main road. "I didn't think of it," I replied. "But I can't help thinking of Black. Poor chap." "Why poor chap?" "Don't you see how it has got a hold of him? He is clearly a charlatan, but he is afraid of himself. Have you never seen a child who is afraid of the dark experimenting with mock bravery? Going into a dark cupboard of which he controls the door handle, he is not really in the dark. Black's tricks are the dark cupboard of which he holds the door handle. I'll bet you he doesn't hold seances by himself." "I wonder," replied Shelton. He was curiously silent all the way back to town. A few weeks later, I noticed casually in the Daily Telegraph the announcement of the death of Augustine Black, FSZ, at his house on Tulse Hill. It was about 3 weeks or a month after this that Mark Shelton rang me up on the telephone. The telephone was not then the universal blessing or curse that it is now, and installations were few and far between, a sort of scientific toy for the chosen few, and I could have counted on my fingers the friends who had them in their houses. Shelton's voice sounded grave and subdued in answer to my cheery greeting. "I want you to dine with me tonight," he said. "Can't possibly. I am dining out." "Oh, but you must," he answered. "I want you particularly. It's most important." "But I tell you I can't. Who else is coming?" "No one. I want you, and you must come. Put your other party off. Tell them it's a matter of life and death." "But, I say—" "Don't say anything," he interrupted. "I'm telling you the truth. I've got something to tell you which must be told here. And it is a matter of life and death. If you don't come, I shall not be alive in the morning." By this time his voice was quivering, and I realized that something very serious was the matter. So I answered curtly, "Oh, all right, I'll come. But don't talk bosh and buck up. What have you been doing with yourself?" "Nothing. I haven't left my rooms for 3 weeks." "All right," I replied. "I'll come and dig you out." I got to the Albany at 7:30 and was let in by his man, the imperturbable Bates. "How is Mr. Shelton?" I asked him casually as I put down my hat and coat. "I don't know, sir," replied Bates. "I can't make him out. Seems to be brooding all the time. Never goes out and doesn't eat anything to speak of." I went into Shelton's sitting room, which was stiflingly hot. Though it was a fine May day, he had a large fire, and all the curtains were closely drawn. Mark was sitting before the fire in his day clothes doing nothing. "Good heavens," I said. "What an atmosphere. No wonder you're nervy. Got any windows open?" "No, and don't open them. I've a reason. Is the air very beastly?" "Not beastly," I said, "but intolerably hot." "Not foul and stuffy?" "No." "Don't you notice a queer smell?" "No. What sort of smell?" "Well," he hesitated a moment and then said, "like the small cat house at the zoo." "Not in the least," I replied. "Whatever is the matter with you?" "I don't know. I want you to tell me." I looked at him critically. Was he the sane and athletic Shelton going mad? The phrase olfactory delusions came into my mind. "Tell me all you can about it," I said. "Presently," he replied. "After dinner." So with that, for the moment, I had to be content. We went in to dinner. As usual, it was exquisite. Shelton could and did afford a perfect cook, and on this occasion she had surpassed herself. Shelton tasted everything and sent his plate away practically untouched. At every dish he said, "Pah, beastly! Don't you notice a filthy taste in this?" No, it's excellent. What kind of taste? Well, and again the hesitation. Like the small cat house at the zoo. It seemed to be a mania. I told him he should consult X, the great nose and ear specialist. He only shook his head wearily. After dinner, he consented to have a window open and to let the fire die down. He told me he had got up a frowst so that I should get it in all its force, but he accepted doubtfully my assurance that the air was perfectly clean. He brought me a volume of Japanese engravings he wanted me to see, and as he leaned over me, he said, "Don't you mind my leaning over you?" And he looked searchingly into my eyes. "Not in the least. Why on earth should I?" "Good God, man, don't you notice that I stink?" "Not at all. What do you imagine you stink of? The small cat house again?" "Yes, that's it. It's ghastly. I can never get away from it." "Tell me," I said quietly, "when and how did this begin?" And he told me a most amazing and horrible story. "You remember Austin Black, the spiritualist zoologist?" "Yes, we took you, Carver and I, to one of his seances. You may have seen that he is dead. Carver and I were there when he died. There was no inquest, for his domestic GP certified the ever-ready heart disease of long standing. There was a seance, only 4 of us, and Black and his medium. Black was awfully strung up that night. He told us the conditions could not be more favorable. It wasn't a show night, and there was no music and no tricks. But queer, uncomfortable things happened. A spreading light over the table, and a leg of my chair suddenly snapped off. We turned up the lights. It seemed to have been bitten through. I wanted to stop, but Black, though he looked ghastly, wouldn't hear of it. He said, "I want to see this thing through. I want to down it." And we started the seance again. Almost immediately I heard that snarling I told you about, and Black, who was on my right, got up in the dark and left the table. We heard a sort of scuffling and then a choking noise in the corner of the room. We switched on the light and saw Black lying on his back by the wall, his tongue out and blue in the face, struggling violently with nothing.
I'm waiting on the window to load, as it normally does.
We rushed up at him and tried to pick him up. There was something that we could not see between us and him, pinning him down. We could feel it, though. It was soft and pulpy, with a surface not furry, but like a mouse or a mole, and huge. And it stank like the small cat house at the zoo. We could not free him of it, and we saw him die, choked before our eyes, whilst we clawed at that soft, pulpy nothing. We could not move it. When he was quite still, the thing got up of its own accord. Carver and I were crouched close together, and the thing forced its way between us and so away. How it stank! It seemed to leave a greasy smear of smell all over us. We called his wife, a queer woman. She did not seem badly shocked or to care much. Carver said afterwards that she seemed to him to be intensely relieved at something. All she said was, "I expected this. It has happened before."
Gabe.
She evidently did not realize that he was dead. "Please go away at once. I will send for his doctor. He is close by." We went. The other two, strangers, and the medium, had bolted directly we turned up the lights. As Carver and I walked down the hill, he said, it's awful, how it stank, and I can't get rid of the stink." No more could I. Carver and I parted at Vauxhall. I never saw him again. I inquired a day or two later and heard he was ill. A week later, I heard he had a stroke and was in a private madhouse. I had baths, Turkish baths. I changed my clothes 6 times a day. I always smelt of that thing. I do still. I can't bear it. I shall go mad like Carver. Everything I touch smells of it. Everything I try to eat tastes of it. I've tried to get over it, and I can't. That's why at last I sent for you and closed up everything and lit a fire to give you the fullest chance. Now I know that I can't do anything. It's in me and part of me. I shall never be free of it. That thing is here with me. It's prowling round all the time, but only I can smell it. God help me. To say that I was horrified is to use a miserably inadequate term. But before I left Mark Shelton that night, I had arranged with him to go in 3 days to Norway fishing. We settled everything, when to start, where to go, and what to take. I left him, still rather dazed, but much easier in my mind. That night, at about 1 a.m., Mark Shelton blew out his brains. End of section 4. Section 5 of The Purple Sapphire and Other Posthumous Papers by Christopher Blayre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blue Cockroach. Dora was responsible. The Dora who punctuated her name after the manner of the plural of mouse as affected by civil engineers. D-O-R-A. Primarily responsible, that is to say, for this is a story of one of the very few instances of that ersatz which devastated Germany during the late unpleasantness, but of which our more favored nation suffered but few aggressions. From another point of view, perhaps the responsibility lies with Itha and Armorel. They are the imperious nieces of the professor of applied chemistry in the University of Cosmopoli. Itha was 12 at the time, and Armorel 8. But having no wife to rule him with a rod of iron, the professor had, by the dire progression of a process for which he was unable to account, gradually become as a slave beneath their ferule, and in the most meager days of Dora's sumptuary regulations, Itha and Armorel had demanded bananas. Well, bananas were at that moment as snakes in Iceland, apparently, and many a rebuff did the professor endure from proud young porters at stores whence of old he had been accustomed to supply his niece's demands. Of course, the professor ought to have been married. So ought Pamela, but the youth of the professor had been spent not only in consuming the midnight oil and other illuminants, but in abstract researches into their nature, composition, and adaptations. He was an acknowledged authority on coal tar products, inverted sugars, and their derivatives, commercial and prophylactic. Pamela had waited, and she had waited too long. By the time the professor had become a member of the Council of the Chemical and a fellow of the Royal Societies, he was a confirmed bachelor, and Pamela had reached the age which used to be labeled in their series of photographs of celebrities female by the Strand magazine as present day. They corresponded at long and met at longer intervals, when Pamela, growing fragrant with the fire of forgotten suns like a winter pear, came up from Wiltshire in a spirit of revolt against the limitations of the provincial milliner. In the meager days above reference to, Pamela was in town, and the professor, rather grudging the expenditure of time involved, had bidden her to lunch with him at the Imperial. A visit to Kingsway in search of chemical glass had the result that his way back to the Imperial lay through Covent Garden Market. At that time a dreary vista of empty windows and derelict packing cases, where erstwhile the fruits of distant lands had been wont to overflow in polychromatic luxuriance. But in one of the windows lay a small bunch, a hand, they called it, of homesick and wary bananas, and the professor remembered the gray reproachful eyes of Itha and Armorel, who could never believe that he could possibly fail them if he really made an effort. He went in. An adolescent representative of an ancient race, who had escaped conscription, received him with scarcely inquisitive apathy. "Are those the only bananas you have?" asked the professor. "And all we are likely to," replied the merchant elliptically. "I am in trouble," said the professor. "I have a little niece who is eagerly desirous of bananas, and she is very delicate," he added as a mendacious afterthought, blushing as he thought of Etha in a dilapidated scout uniform perched in the highest branches of a tree or careering along the sands bareback on a repatriated army remount. "Do you think you could help me?" The adolescent Oriental looked him over with a scrutiny which became, in the end, sympathetic. Perhaps he had a niece or something and understood. "Bill?" A subterranean noise as though the dirty floor were in labor, and from a square hole in the planks at their feet half a human being emerged. This was evidently part of Bill, a sinister figure, midway between Phil's squad and Quilp. A vision of strabismus and a fustian cap. "Could you find this gentleman a hand or two of bananas out of that case, you know?" Disappearance of the upper half of Bill, a sound of rending timbers, and presently his reappearance with 2 hands, beautiful golden bananas, and the nether portion of his person. "Beauties," remarked Bill. "Come yesterday." "How much?" inquired the professor. When he recovered, he saw himself mentally a poorer, but a better man. The merchant was delivering a lecture upon the economics of war and the iniquities of Dora. And as he turned the hand over, that its excellence might act as an anesthetic to the operation of extraction, there ran out upon the counter the blue cockroach. Unconsciously, the professor, like the poet in the den of the scarabee, recoiled, but no scarabee was there to murmur without emotion, "Blata!" But Bill was there. "Ah," said he, "I've seen him before. Queer things we get sometimes in the cases. Lizards, snakes, and whatnot. Once I found a monkey. Jolly little beggar, he was all right. Lived on the fruit. We used to take them to the live beast place at the end. Shut up now." "Don't you ever get bitten or stung?" "No, we're careful. This fellow's harmless." It was a most lovely beast. In shape and size identical with the cockroaches which stray among one's brushes on board ship, and architecturally indistinguishable from the larger members of the kitchen family, the blue cockroach was clad in a pure pale azure, as if a cunning artificer in enamels had fashioned it, and had given to its surface a texture of the finest smooth velvet. Its long antennae waved inquiringly back and forth, its tiny eyes sparkled black with crimson points, and then it began to run. The professor caught it in his hand as it toppled from the edge of the counter. It bit him. A curious, sickening little puncture like the nip of an earwig. A sensation of heat, and then of cold that ran all over him. And Bill and the merchant grew nebulous, and waved about. The professor had never fainted in his life, but he said to himself, "This is how they must feel." In a moment it was all over. He had shaken off the insect, and true to the scientific instinct, he took out of his pocket one of the corked tubes he had just acquired and drove the blue cockroach into it. "One of the fellows at the museum may like to have it," he said. The merchant shrugged his shoulders. A boot heel, not a corked tube, seemed to him to be the appropriate climax to the odyssey of the blue cockroach. For some inexplicable reason, however, he reduced the price he had quoted from the limits of chimera to within the bounds of extravagance, and the professor went upon his way, the bananas in his hand and the blue cockroach in his pocket. A tiny point on his right palm showed where the insect had attacked him, but beyond that the incident was closed. As he proceeded along Coventry Street, the professor became aware of a great calm, an undefined happiness. He had regarded his appointment with Pamela more in the light of a kindly duty than as an occasion for pleasurable anticipation. But now he suddenly found himself looking forward to their meeting with a keen sense of curiosity and satisfaction. It was too long since they met last. He felt sure she would have come to town sooner had he expressed a wish in that direction in his letters. What a handsome creature she had been when he was a student. What a shame it was that she had never married. The professor found himself quietly wondering why, if, whether. "I am 54, said he to himself, but he smiled frowningly, or frowned smilingly. "She's a wonderful woman," was his first thought as she rose to greet him from the big chair in the vestibule. Indeed, Pamela seemed much younger than he remembered her to have looked a year ago. She seemed to radiate that impression of delicate strength and ultra-feminine self-reliance, which constitutes the undefinable charm of many middle-aged spinsters. Their lunch was delightful. Pamela seemed as though she were starting fresh. The professor seemed to have shed his professorial armor, and to have become once more a human being. He entertained her with descriptions of his war activities, no longer as of yore skimming over the subject, but letting her into the secret chamber of his ambitions, his aspirations, his work. When a man of the professor's intellectual eminence exerts himself to charm, the charm is dangerously subtle. An element of flattery pervades the exercise, which is, or should be, irresistible. Pamela did not resist. She had never been called upon to resist, and was not going to begin now. 30 years fell away as time wasted in sleep. It is not a disagreeable admission. Indeed, there is a curious emotional joy predominant when two people who should have been lovers find themselves saying to their hearts, "What fools we have been." By the time that the arrival of coffee and cigarettes had cleared away the last barriers which had erected themselves upon their voyage of rediscovery, the professor was virtually identifying Pamela with his life work. "It is not all explosives and bacteriology," he confided to her. "I have been at work upon substitutes for sugar, and I have found one which will be a godsend to the people who properly detest saccharin. I have brought here a little tube of my finished article. It has all the sweetening properties of the finest cane sugar. Will you try it?" Of course she would. If it had been a dangerous poison, she would have gladly offered herself as a martyr to science. His science. "You need not be afraid of it. It is not only a wonderful sweetener, it is also a powerful prophylactic. It acts like an atoxyl that would kill with extraordinary rapidity any pathogenic organisms in the system. I look forward to trying it as a remedy for sleeping sickness, yellow fever, any of the tropical diseases carried by insects which inject death-dealing bacteria, trypanosomes, into our blood by their bites. My dear," she quivered, "I believe I hold here one of the greatest discoveries that has ever been made in prophylactic medicine." They sweetened their coffee, each with a tiny pellucid crystal. "It is just like real sugar," she said dreamily, "not harsh like saccharin. My dear," his eyes grew narrower, "I do believe you are right. I am so proud of you." She ended with a little contented sigh which was half a laugh, and looked round the restaurant, which was by this time gradually becoming empty, and wondered whether anyone else there looked out upon their worlds with so supreme a sensation of satisfaction and fulfillment as she. What fools they had been. The professor also finished his coffee and leaned back in his chair, looking round the room with a sudden sensation of discomfort. He had just thought again of the blue cockroach. The reason he had thought of it was that he had suddenly experienced, as it were, a return of the sensation which came over him at the moment it bit him. It was, however, only momentary, though, casually glancing at his hand, it seemed as if the little puncture were more visible than it had been. And then a remarkable thing happened. He turned again to Pamela, and saw her with new, or rather with old, eyes. He found her eyes fastened upon him with a mingled expression of apprehension and curiosity, and as he returned her gaze, she blushed vividly. He felt strangely uncomfortable, and without any conscious volition on his part, he found himself going rapidly over in his mind their conversation of the previous hour. It was surely waste of time to orate for an hour to this dull but worthy person upon a subject which could have no interest for her and of which she could not possibly understand a single word. He was dissatisfied with himself and naturally blamed her vaguely for his dissatisfaction and discomfort. "Well," he said, "it has been very pleasant seeing you again, Pamela. We must not let it be so long again, before—" His stereotyped phrases lost themselves in embarrassed silence. He asked for the bill. It seemed to him rather excessive. However, just for once. Pamela had not ceased looking at him. She was puzzled. It seemed to her as if a newly opened door had been quietly but relentlessly shut in her face. The professor certainly had aged a good deal since she saw him last. She had not noticed it before. An uncomfortable sensation crept over her that she had been expansive beyond warrantable limits with this grave gray man, and she felt a little hot under an impression that she had allowed the conversation to stray beyond what was quite seemly and decorous at her age. She was rather relieved that he seemed in a hurry to get away. She had all an intelligent woman's horror of an anticlimax. An hour later, she was in the train. At that moment, the professor laid down his pen in his study and looked before him out of the window. The same thought struck both of them simultaneously. What fools we were. Now whether there be truth or no in that which the native priests do aver, I know not, nor may I make more curious inquiry. But if it be indeed the fact that the sting of divers of their flies do engender passions of love, hate, and the like, then the matter is curious and worthy of inquiry. But such as I did make inquiry of, did postpone me with shrewd cunning and avoiding answer. Nor would they be come at to speak further upon it, at that or any other time. Footnote. The true account of the travels in the distant lands of the learned Dr. Frenzelius Bott, wherein many curious customs and wisdom of the inhabitants are truly set down. Clayton, 1614, page 117. End of section 5. Section 6 of The Purple Sapphire and Other Posthumous Papers by Christopher Blayre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Demon. And so on. Bless the telephone, said the Regius Professor of Medicine. I make use of a conventional euphuism. It was not a blessing that the Regius Professor invoked in favor of the National Telephone Company, the mention of which dates the events which I am about to relate. It was before a paternal government had assumed that control, which enabled it to provide the last straw, which gave the hump to that patient animal, the British public. Yes, hello? Sir George Amboyne was in the middle of writing an important paragraph in an important paper, and he felt as if someone had suddenly thrust a marling spike between the spokes of the flywheel of his mind, and had brought the machinery of thought to a crashing and dislocating stop. It was a law, both written and unwritten, that he was not to be rung up by his friends during the working hours of the morning. He was prepared to be nasty. Is that you, Reggie? A guttural laugh rattled the microphone. What do you want? Asked the professor, with that lapse from grammar which is universal in the circumstances. A contralto voice replied, I want Sir George Amboyne for FRS, etc. Don't you know me, Reggie? It's me, Cynthia. Again the grammar of telephonic speech. A wave of disgust and disquiet surged over the professor. Reggie. There was only one person in the world, the most unexpected person in the world, who had, on the last occasion on which he had seen her, suggested that this would be a humorous and affectionate name for him, an echo or contraction of his title, Regius Professor of Medicine. It had made him shudder with disgust, the more so as the authoress of this solecism had been for long years his most dainty, refined, and delicate friend, Cynthia Carlyon. He had hoped that the manner in which he had received the suggestion had made the occasion unique, a joke never to be repeated. I am George Amboyne, he replied, with as much severity as one can assume over the telephone wire. That's all right, Reggie dear. I know you don't like it, but you've got to put up with it. I don't like it, Cynthia. What do you want? I'm very much occupied. I know you are. That's why I thought it would be fun to ring you up. Again the guttural laugh. It seemed a pity that the laughter could not see his face as he heard it. Will you please tell me what you want? I'm feeling dissipated and devilish. I want you to come and play with me. You might take me out to lunch. I am sorry, but it is quite impossible. Oh, damn. Please, Cynthia, don't. It's horrible. If you want to see me particularly, I will come to you after 4. No good today, old chap. I've got a brand new Johnny coming to tea, and I want him all to myself. He went back to his desk and sat down, but he could not go on with his work. He sat staring out of the window. It was horrible. That this vulgar, slangy creature could possibly be Cynthia absolutely stunned his senses. The most dainty, the most delicate, flower-like. He gave it up, and leaning his forehead upon his hands, he groaned aloud. Some years, less than a decade before the date of this unpleasant incident, Cynthia Carlyon occupied the position of queen of a cult. She stood out in the literary, the artistic, and the Scientific Society of Cosmopoli, as it were, an object of reverent and affectionate worship. She was beautiful in the manner of a Titian Madonna, a reddish gold woman of infinite grace and perfect taste. A poetess, an essayist, a musician, a painter, she met the men of literature, science, and art on their own ground. As a bachelor girl, to use a phrase which was invented by him long afterwards, of independent means, she had a real salon, where one met everybody worth meeting from an intellectual point of view. She was popularly supposed to have refused to marry every man who had ever come under the spell of her curious crooked smile. It was the probationary stage through which he who would join her charmed and charming circle had to pass. This formality satisfactorily accomplished, and the period of convalescence, or quarantine, safely negotiated, you settled down into your place in her studio. No one ever resumed the quest of Cynthia. He merely adopted the cult. And then, to the horror of all of us, she came back from Florence one fatal spring day, married to Max Carline. Carline was a blackguard. He was an adventurer of the subtle type, not the flamboyant. He had tried that, and it had proved a miss. He also drank, and, as Herodotus would put it, this is all that we shall say about Max Carline, except that he curdled a coterie, and Cynthia's salon was reduced to the faithful few who put up with him when he was present, rejoiced when he was absent, and melted away when he came home drunk. Among these, Sir George Amboyne, who was appointed to the Regius Professorship of Medicine in the University of Cosmopoli about 2 years later, was one of the most faithful. In the events which followed, he was also the last. But this is to anticipate. About 2 years after her disastrous marriage, Cynthia faded. Indeed, she obviously became very ill. Her condition became so alarming that Amboyne insisted that he should merge the friend and the surgeon.
Thank you. I appreciate you. They're actually getting better, but I'll be right back.
and he, with a no less eminent colleague, after a careful and heartbreaking examination, pronounced upon Cynthia Carline sentence of death, humanly speaking. She underwent a terrible operation and took up her abode in a charming nursing home a little way outside the town.
Nursing home?
So we waited for the end. But whether by reason of some hidden force of vitality or of her determination not to give up, the end did not come. A year passed, and the deathbed of Cynthia became an institution. Indeed, it may be said to have become a social function. Her friends rallied round her, and each of them had his or her appointed hour, when they met round the bed, where she lay like a bright and cheerful Madonna, told her the news, brought her their books and pictures, played to her, she had a baby grand in her room, and by degrees a new and highly selective salon gathered again by her bedside. During the second year of this strange existence, the disease woke up again. Since that time, the scourge of cancer has surrendered to the besieging forces of science, and now we know what to do to eradicate it. But in those days, the cure, persistently sought, had eluded the vigilance of its untiring pursuers. I walked away from her bedside one day with George Amboyne through the as yet undesecrated lanes of Bromley, and I asked him, "Is this the end?" "Humanly speaking," he replied, "yes, unless a miracle were to happen. And miracles do not happen in the clinics of cancer." "Well, how long will she live?" "Perhaps a month, possibly longer, but I hope not." 2 days after this, I was astonished to receive a note from the matron of the nursing home, couched in the following terms: "Sir, I am instructed by Mrs. Carline's medical attendant to request you to discontinue your visits until further notice. He hopes that in a week or two you will be able to resume them." Mrs. Carline's medical attendant? George Amboyne? What the... I jumped into a hansom cab and was at Amboyne's house in less than a quarter of an hour. I found him at breakfast. I had not breakfasted. "What is the meaning of this?" I said, putting the matron's letter before him. "What it says," he replied. "But you..." "I am no longer Mrs. Carline's medical attendant." "For heaven's sake, explain," said I. "Carline called upon me yesterday morning." "Was he sober?" "Partially. He asked me what hope I had of his wife's life. I told him none. He said, 'Then you will not be surprised if I call in another opinion.' I said, 'Not at all. I shall be happy to meet any other medical man that you may call in.' He smiled his beastly, unctuous smile and said, 'I don't think you will be troubled.' And so he left me. Well, what next?" Amboyne handed me a letter which had been lying open by his plate.
And there it is.
"Dear Dr. Amboyne, Mr. Carline's visit to you will have prepared you to hear that, at his request, I have taken over the treatment of his wife. I shall be happy to meet you on the case if you can time your visit to coincide with mine. Yours faithfully, Erasmus Quayle." Huh? Erasmus Quayle is a quack. He advertises in provincial and clerical papers. Cancer cured by an infallible treatment. Payment by results. No cure, no charge. Good God. And are you going to meet him? On a first impulse, no, of course not. And yet, Cynthia, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. He'll kill her. No, that is predestined. But this man, he is an honorary MD of some Middle West American institute which sells degrees. Keeps his patients alive for a bit by some preparation of his own, sometimes for months. He announces a cure, gets paid enormously, and then clears out. The patient then dies. What's to be done? I don't know. Excuse me, there's a telephone. In a few minutes, he returned, very pale and obviously very much distressed. Well, that settles it, he said quietly. Carline is on the telephone. He says that Dr. Quayle thinks it unnecessary to trouble me, and that his wife would rather I did not call until I hear from her. There's only one gleam of light in the murk, I said. I hear that the matron exercises her authority and does not let Carline see his wife when he is too drunk. Yes, that's something, replied Amboyne. 2 years passed by. 3 weeks after the conversation I have recorded with George, Sir George Amboyne, I, in common with the others of her intimates, received a letter from Cynthia asking me to come and see her. I went, of course, at once. Frankly, I was amazed. "Come in, dear man," she called out as I opened the door. "Come in. What do you think of me? I am cured." I cannot describe what I felt. The room seemed to spin round me. All I could say was, "Thank God, dear Cynthia." "And Dr. Quayle," replied she rather wistfully. "I know I must not say too much about him to you people. Fortunately, he refuses to meet any of my friends, but look at the result." I could only murmur commonplaces. The foundations of my belief in medical science were being shaken. But there it was. Cynthia seemed to be quite her old self. Amboyne came in whilst I was there. It was not a very comfortable meeting. Indeed, we were both relieved when Cynthia told us that for a few weeks she must cut her interview shorter than she would like. And we left her. We went into the matron's sanctum, and after the ordinary greetings, Amboyne said to her, "This is remarkable, matron. What does it all mean?" "I don't know," she replied with an air of visible distress. "It passes everyone's comprehension. This Mr. Quayle." "Yes," said Amboyne encouragingly. "Can you tell me?" "No," she replied. "It's all mysterious. He cooks things in a little pot behind the screen. He brings the materials and takes them away again. We merely give his medicines as he directs. It is most extraordinary and unsatisfactory." And with that, we left her. Amboyne was silent all the way back to town, like the parrot of folklore. And then the 2 years went by. Cynthia received her friends as before Carline kept in the background, but I gathered indirectly from the matron that at intervals he made scenes about money. Cynthia spoke of moving to a less expensive room. I remembered grimly the legend in gold on some of the fancy mugs at Schwalbach. "Man arger dein Frau nicht, das Keur kostet viel Geld." At the end of 2 years, I went one day to the home for my bi-weekly visit and met Amboyne in the hall. "You can't go in," he said. "Cynthia is dying." "Dying?" "Yes. Quayle has given up the case, made all he can, I suppose. Says she grew overconfident and disobeyed orders. I was sent for this morning. She is quite unconscious. She will not regain consciousness. It is the end." We came away. Outside, Carline, speechlessly drunk, was being led firmly away by a policeman. But Cynthia did not die. I called next morning, and the matron told me that after being dead, as they all supposed, for 2 hours, her eyelids suddenly flickered and she regained consciousness. In the morning, she seemed much stronger and asked for food. "You had better not see her," said the good woman. "She is very fretful and uneasy, so unlike herself, quite disagreeable. I am very worried over it all. I ring up Mr. Quayle, and he refused to come. So this morning I sent for Sir George Amboyne. He seemed very shocked." For several weeks there was no fresh development in this astonishing case. I had a note from Cynthia, merely saying, "Don't come till I let you know. I'm growing stronger every day." I saw Amboyne. He could give me no news, beyond that she seemed to gain strength every day, according to the report of the nurses. He had not seen her since the first day. He had received the same note as I had. He hesitated a moment and then said, "I am afraid that you will experience, and so shall I, a shock when we see her again. From what the matron tells me, she is woefully changed for the worse. They say she is a trying patient, and they will be glad to get rid of her." "Get rid of her?" "Yes, she talks of leaving the home in about a fortnight." "Leaving the home?" He shrugged his shoulders. "Yes, that's it. All we can do is wait." We waited 3 weeks, and then on the morning of an unforgettable day I received a letter from Cynthia, dated from a second-rate hotel in the Southwest District, asking me to call upon her. She told me not to call till the afternoon, as I'm going on a jamboree to a music hall tonight, and don't get up very early anyhow. I've been here 10 days, but didn't tell any of you good, serious old fogies. I wanted to have a fling around before I encounter your solemn mugs and high-flown ideas, and have to become serious and respectable again after all these wasted years. I took the note round to Harley Street, and thence to the university, where Amboyne was lecturing, and I waited for him. I showed him the note, and for all reply he took another from his pocket and handed it to me. It said, "Here I am, you see, in spite of your determination to kill me. What price infallibility for the mortuary stakes? But come along and see your little Cynthia, and make up for a lot of lost time. You have become no end of a swell since I took ill, as the servants say. Regius Professor, I bow. But what a mouthful. I think I shall call you Reggie in future." I handed it back and looked at him speechless. Isn't it horrible? He said in a low tone. What do you make of it? Let us go and see, I replied. We went that afternoon, and were shown into a tawdry sitting room which smelt of dust and patchouli. Cynthia was lolling on a green rep sofa, smoking a cigarette. Carline was sitting by her side and got up sheepishly as we entered. Well, so long, old girl, he said huskily. I'll leave you with your intellectual friends. He gave a short laugh as he turned to us and said, You'll find the old girl a bit different to what she was. And a jolly good thing, too. She's woken up fine. We sat down, and for a moment we simply could not utter a sound. Was this Cynthia? Yes. It was the same willowy figure, the brown eyes, the fine long hands and feet. But her hair, in place of her red-gold aureole, was a short, thick crop of black, curly stubble. The expression in her eyes was that of an animal gathering itself together to spring. She was the first to break the silence. Good Lord, how glum you both look. You look as if you had never seen me before. Have a cigarette, or a drink, or both, and let's be jolly. Are you sure, said Amboyne, that you are not overtaxing your strength? I should hardly... Oh, for heaven's sake, don't preach at me, Reggie. I beg your pardon? Yes, Reggie. Don't you think it's rather nice for a Regius Professor? Much nicer than George. A dull, solemn name, but don't be dull and solemn with me. I've kicked free and I'm going to have a good time. Be jolly or stop away. If you are going to look at me like that, I prefer Max. He's a sportsman. The interview was a short one. To this day, I don't know how we got through it. She was dreadful. When we got up to go, she did not try to detain us, nor did she ask when we would come again. We got into the street somehow. I found that I could hardly speak above a whisper, but I said, What is it? I don't know. I don't know. But I think
That's tough.
It is a demon. Amboyne, pull yourself together. Do it yourself. You are shaking all over. It's difficult, but... And he stopped dead and looked straight at me. Didn't you see it, lurking behind the eyes that used to be Cynthia's, watching us to see whether we recognized it? Yes, I did. But I was glad the Regius Professor of Medicine had mentioned it first. And this brings us to the morning with which I opened this record, when Cynthia Carline rang up the Regius Professor for fun. He got through the routine of the day, consultations, a lecture at the university, a committee at the Royal Society, and arrived home exhausted with work which had been made painful and difficult by a suppressed emotion of horror. He was just sitting down to the simulacrum of dinner when the telephone rang again. A woman's voice in a flutter of excitement. Is that Dr. Reginald Burgoyne?
Damn, dude.
Amboyne is my name, Sir George Amboyne. Beg pardon, I didn't know whether to say George or Reginald. You are the doctor? Yes. Please come at once to the hotel. A lady, Mrs. Carline, is calling out for you something awful. What has happened? I don't know, sir. I'm the manageress. The lady had a gent to tea, and when he had gone, I heard a screech and went in to her. She was in a fit, seemingly, screaming something awful. I got to her bed and called in the doctor. She keeps calling for you, he says. I thought he said the name of Burgoyne. She called out Reggie and George. Will you come, sir? Please do. The doctor says so. At once, replied Amboyne. In the tawdry sitting room, he met a harassed-looking young practitioner, obviously paralyzed at finding himself face-to-face with the world-renowned Regius Professor. Epilepsy, I suppose, sir, with submission, but I don't know. I never saw anything like it before. And her language, it is frightful, like sometimes in a puerile fever. Will you see her? They went in. Cynthia, the old placid Cynthia, save for the short black hair, was lying in bed as the woman of the house had left her. The old, tender, half-humorous eyes were open, and as Amboyne leaned over her, she said softly, It was good of you to come, George. Don't let them take me away again. Of course not, dear. I'll look after you. Can you, do you think? I have been in hell. But as she spoke, the demon flashed into her eyes, and she sprang to a sitting position with a wild cry like an animal in pain. The Regius Professor put his arm round her, and she clawed at his face, but only for a moment. Then she sank in his arm, and he laid her gently back upon the bed. That was all. End of section 6.
I smashed the snake's head when I was a kid. That's what I'm talking about.
Section 7. Of the Purple